Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a name folding in on itself through time. A name that begins as a title, son of a dragon, son of a pledge, and over centuries becomes other things: rumor, terror, a character in a novel, a brand on a tourist map. Names do strange work. They hold more than identities. They carry histories, choices, errors, and the hunger of later storytellers who need a monster to explain the present. Tonight, I want to walk you along that folded seam. Not to tell you the cartoon version of Dracula you already know, but to trace the slow, human logic that turned a man into a myth. We'll examine the pressures, the decisions, the political geometry of 15th century Eastern Europe that produced a ruler who chose terror as policy. And then we'll follow the quieter trail, how an author a world away found that name in a cramped footnote and, by chance and taste, built a different kind of immortality around it. The story is both more moral and more complicated than folklore. It's a study of how necessity hardens into policy, how reputation becomes a weapon, and how stories, once loose in the world, refashion history. We begin with a small, cold room in a stone fortress. A child is born into a family that bears a strange, double-edged name. His father has joined an order sworn to defend Christendom. He wears a dragon on his breast, and the political cost of that badge is immediate and exact. The sobriquet Dracula, the dragon, and its genitive son, Dracula, are not metaphors yet. They are inheritances. They are intentions. They are political identities in a world that measures loyalty in armor and tribute. That child grows into Vlad. He is not a creature of the night. He is flesh and bone, thirsty for a kind of order that the world he inherits simply cannot sustain without violence. His life is a reaction to the peculiar geometry of his country, a small principality sandwiched between empires, a narrow corridor of land that every great power wants to control because it controls the passes through the Carpathians. To be prince of that land is to sit at the crossroads of competing sovereignties: Hungary, Poland, Moldavia, and the Ottoman Empire, and to juggle their demands with the fragile loyalties of a fractious nobility. Survive, and you may prosper. Fail, and you die. History gives us dates and facts, and those facts matter. Vlad's father, Vlad II, received the dragon's collar, the Order of the Dragon, a symbolic pledge that shaped how contemporaries and later chroniclers named and understood the family. That is not myth. It is recorded in the sources historians use. The child's childhood fractures into a sequence of forms that will shape his politics. At roughly 11 years of age, he is sent with his brother to the Ottoman court as a hostage, a common diplomatic practice in the Middle Ages meant to secure a father's loyalty. The experience of being held in Edirne, Adrianople, is crucial. It is not merely captivity, it is an education under an empire that both terrifies and fascinates. There, he studies military technique, language, and the exercise of power as spectacle and punishment. He also witnesses punishments delivered with absolute severity. The Ottoman legal imagination included severe corporal penalties that could be swift and savage. Exposure to that reality, imprinting itself on a young, observant mind, is a fact supported by the primary traditions and later historiography. Contrast that with the experience of his brother Radu, who adapted more smoothly, who folded into the Ottoman court's life and the politics it offered. Two brothers, two outcomes, one hardened into defiance, another assimilated into a rival sphere. The family's domestic tragedy deepens when Vlad's father and elder brother are removed from the board through murder and betrayal in the chaotic politics of the region. Allegiances shifted like weather. Violence was routine. These are the conditions in which a young man learns to read power, the way most of us learn to read faces. When, in 1456, Vlad claims the princely seat of Wallachia, the principality sometimes anglicized in older texts, he inherits not only a throne, but a collapsed political ecology. Feuding noble families, the boyars, had grown powerful, and the institutions of governance were hollowed out by opportunism and the constant pressure of larger empires. Vlad's response was structural and brutal. He set about remaking the base of power itself so it could not be bought or infiltrated. He sought to break the power of the noble families and replace them with men whose status depended on him alone. The historical record attests to this strategy. It is visible in the measures he took early in his rule and in the outcomes that followed. This is where the ethical questions begin to press. Many viewers have already read the sensational pamphlets that spread through Central Europe soon after Vlad's death, woodcut prints designed to horrify and delegitimize him. They are ugly propaganda, and they are useful to us precisely because they are unreliable. They perform a function in the politics of memory, to fix a man's reputation as monstrous. But the existence of propaganda does not erase reality. Vlad's primary method of securing order was terror. He used impalement and public spectacle of pain as instruments of governance. That is not a matter of rumor. It is attested in contemporary accounts and remembered in multiple traditions, Ottoman as well as Christian. What later printmakers did was amplify and stylize those facts into caricature. Pause here and consider the logic behind public terror. You can understand it as a crude kind of rationality. If the state cannot win a battle of resources or manpower against a neighbor, it may seek to raise the cost of occupation. If rebellion is cheap, rebellion will occur often. If rebellion is expensive, public, it may deter. Vlad weaponized horror because in the arithmetic of his time and place it worked. That is a cold way to analyze atrocity, but it is essential if we are to avoid myth. The purpose was less bloodlust than governance, a political instrument, however morally abhorrent. Historians who study his reign emphasize this functional argument even while they debate the scale and the precise motives. You do not need to linger on gore to understand this. You need to look at effect. One of Vlad's most consequential military episodes, and the one that crystallized his reputation abroad, was the campaign of 1462. Facing an Ottoman army that dwarfed his own forces, Vlad used the terrain, scorched earth tactics, harassment, and psychological operations in combination. He poisoned wells, destroyed supplies, and refused the enemy easy logistics. He then staged a daring night attack near Targovishte, intended to strike at the heart of the Ottoman command. The historical accounts of that campaign, of the night attack and of the forest of impaled prisoners left along the road, show a calculated blend of guerrilla warfare and theatrical intolerance. Scholars still debate the exact figures and the scale of deaths. The broad outlines are agreed upon. The campaign baffled and repulsed parts of the Ottoman force, and it contributed to Mehmed II's decision to withdraw significant elements of his army. That operational effect, frightening the enemy enough to blunt the campaign, is part of the documented strategic outcome. Do not mistake this for strategy without consequence. Scorched earth destroys the land that feeds your people. Impalement terrorizes your own subjects along with enemies. Roger of record, when the European pamphleteers reproduced lurid images of a prince dining among impaled corpses, those images proved persuasive because they played on generalized horror, yet they also exaggerated. Good history requires calibration. Vlad's tactics were extreme, and they inflicted real suffering on his people. But the lurid modern accounts inflate details for drama. To keep our moral footing, we treat both parts as true. The cruelty is undeniable. Some of the claims surrounding it are exaggeration. Trust but verify, and the verification comes from cross-checking chronicles, letters, and the archaeology where available. His brutal measures produced short-term order. Banditry dropped. Merchants could travel with less fear of robbery because punishments for thieves were swift and fatal. The logic for Vlad was simple. Horror as the fastest path to stability when no other resources can be mobilized. It worked as long as the state could sustain the costs. It failed when the political system surrounding him, allies, patrons, overlords, decided that he had become more liability than ally. And this brings us, inevitably, to betrayal among Christians. Politics is not a simple narrative of good men defending against bad. Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, saw Vlad at different times as useful and then as risky. In 1462, when political winds shifted, Matthias arrested Vlad and kept him imprisoned for years. There are preserved documents and historiographical consensus pointing to this imprisonment, and the forgeries or alleged letters Matthias used to justify it. The upshot: Vlad's political isolation was as consequential as his battlefield choices. Even the man who had tried to use terror to secure his country's independence could not survive the shifting calculus of his allies. This is a theme the popular myth skips. The myth prefers eternal, supernatural evil. The historical record prefers contingency. Vlad's life is a parable about contingency. Hostagehood, exile, revenge, temporary triumph, and ultimately an end in which his count of allies did not match his appetite for punishment. In the final years, we find him briefly restored to power and then killed in battle or assassinated in 1476-77. The precise circumstances remain murky in the sources, but a head was shown in Constantinople as proof of his death. That too is attested across chronicles and diplomatic reports. So far we have walked among causes: the geopolitics, the hostage education, the strategic logic of terror, the betrayal by allies, the battlefield tactics. All of these move far from the image of a pale man flapping a cape, and far closer to a political actor making monstrous choices under crushing constraints. That understanding is not designed to exculpate, it is designed to explain. A humane explanation does not excuse moral culpability, but it does offer lessons. When institutions are weak, cruelty becomes available as policy. When survival is framed as existential, the moral imagination narrows. Now shift perspective with me, as if tilting the map to see the larger pattern. A man called Vlad is dead. His bones, whether at Snagov Monastery, Kamana, or elsewhere, recede into the grave of uncertain archaeology. He is, to locals, a complicated memory, defender, tyrant, a ruler who both protected and tormented his people. For centuries he remains a regional memory, a historical footnote carried in chronicles and folk tales, neither wholly demonized nor wholly sanctified. Then, in the late 19th century, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker, working from notes and travelogues, slips the name Dracula into his manuscript. The author reads a travel account and copies a footnote. Dracula, a local patronymic or sobriquet, means dragon, devil, a name applied to men of courage or cruelty. Stoker borrows the name, an accident of research and taste, and transposes it into a Gothic imagination. In doing so, he fuses local folklore about vampiric revenants with a historical name already freighted with darkness. The result is not history, it is genius of a different kind. Myth-making. The connection between the historical prince and the fictional count is real but tenuous. Stoker used the name
and set his tale in Transylvania, and the rest is cultural engineering. Scholars who have traced Stoker's notes show clearly that Wilkinson's travelogue and other sources provided material for the novelist's imagination. Here is the philosophical pivot. We should ask, why did the public prefer the vampire to the prince? Why does the monstrous version win out in the collective imagination? The answer is twofold. First, fiction carries a kind of moral safety. We can confront cruelty when it is rendered supernatural, because we are insulated from the uncomfortable truth that ordinary humans, upon sufficient provocation, trauma, or opportunity, can do terrible things. Second, fiction offers psychological economy. It compresses complex causality into a single archetype. A vampire is pure predator. A prince is messy. The vampire allows us to externalize and objectify the evil we fear. The prince forces us to examine the structures that enable it. The story's moral weight lies here. The literal monster absolves us of a task we should instead take up. Understanding how institutions decay, how war and exile and political necessity can narrow moral vision, and how humans, not monsters, commit atrocities. If we substitute demon for human, we forfeit the lesson. This does not mean the vampire is worthless. Stoker's Count Dracula and the films and novels that followed are powerful cultural tools. They let us explore death, desire, sexuality, the uncanny. They are mirrors in which cultures see what they fear most. But when the myth eclipses the man entirely, we lose access to the historical lessons that are more difficult and, ultimately, more consequential. Before I ask you whether you want me to continue, a brief note about sources. I have leaned on established historical syntheses and reputable summaries for the factual threads we followed. Vlad's lifespan and notoriety, the hostage years, his methods of rule, the 1462 campaign and night attack, his imprisonment under Matthias Corvinus, and the late 19th century link via Stoker's research. These are documented in standard references and scholarly summaries. For the details about his years of rule, imprisonment, and the sources Stoker used, see the reviewed historical entries and modern summaries that collect contemporary chronicles and archival material. If you'd like, I can proceed to the next section, where we deepen the psychology, layer in selective episodes, told with atmospheric, sleep-friendly cadence, and trace how the myth concretized in literature, film, and popular memory, and do so with even tighter citation for any specific claim you want validated. For now we remain at the hinge, the man as political actor, the myth as psychological projection. There is a silence that follows truths we'd rather not face, a kind of inner quiet that feels like standing at the edge of an old forest at dusk, unsure whether the shadows hide animals, ghosts, or simply our imagination. That is the silence that surrounds the historical Dracula, not the vampire, not the immortal seducer, the man. Because once we strip away the theatrical cape, once we silence the bats and dim the moonlight, what remains is harder to categorize. A man whose childhood was torn between two worlds, a hostage who learned empire from the inside, a ruler who governed with philosophy more than madness, though the philosophy was one steeped in terror, a political actor trying to hold a land that every great power wanted to swallow. And now that the historical scaffolding is in place, we can begin to study the mind behind those decisions. Not as armchair psychologists attempting the impossible, but as observers trying to understand the pressures of the age. Consider for a moment the fundamental difference between mythic evil and political evil. Mythic evil, the vampire count, has no context. He is evil because the story requires it. He is evil because he must be the shadow side of humanity, seductive, predatory, eternal. But political evil is contextual. It lives inside pressures, threats, shortages, betrayals, invasions, geography, poverty, war. It evolves hour by hour depending on who marches at your borders, who poisons your well, who controls your trade routes, who manipulates your nobles. It changes as fast as alliances change. Vlad's decisions, the ones that history remembers with horror, become comprehensible only when seen through this lens. Not justified, not excused, but explained. Because cruelty without purpose is chaos. Cruelty with purpose is policy. And Vlad's cruelty was nothing if not methodical. Imagine a small principality with a population so limited that losing a single harvest could collapse its economy. Imagine a nobility so fractious that they had killed half a dozen princes in a single generation. Imagine being caught between a Christian kingdom demanding tribute and an Islamic empire threatening invasion, while your own nobles wait for any sign of weakness to replace you. This is not a world where mercy survives. And Vlad learned early, through the death of his father, through the betrayal of his brother, through the humiliation of captivity, that mercy was punished, not rewarded. It's important to sit with that, not because it redeems him, but because it explains the stark clarity of his choices. Every prince of the region faced similar pressures. Most fell. A few survived by becoming something the age required. Immovable, terrifying, strategically cruel. Vlad became the most extreme example. But here is the philosophical turn that most histories skip. When does necessity become identity? When does a man stop acting out of survival and start acting out of self-image? Historical evidence suggests Vlad began with necessity. His earliest executions had political targets, boyars who betrayed his father, rebels who threatened the throne. But over time, necessity hardened into something more. Patterns, methods, rituals. The famous Easter feast where he arrested and executed the boyars. At first glance, it reads like a bloodbath. But look closely. In context, it is the dismantling of a political class whose power had destabilized the principality for decades. Brutal? Absolutely. Politically effective? In the short term, yes. But then the methods grew, expanded, spread beyond politics into everyday life. Thieves, adulterers, tax evaders, even beggars. Something had shifted. Vlad no longer saw cruelty as targeted governance. He saw it as a universal solution. Once terror works, it becomes tempting to use it everywhere. This is where history and psychology blur. Trauma repeated becomes logic. Logic repeated becomes identity. Identity repeated becomes legend. And Vlad's legend grew long before his name reached the West. In the Balkans, people whispered his name with a mixture of fear and respect. Not because they believed he was supernatural, that came centuries later. They believed he was inevitable, a force, a storm, something that could not be negotiated with, only survived. But here is the irony. Terror creates order, but it also creates fragility. A state built on fear stands tall until the first sign of weakness. Once fear breaks, loyalty evaporates. And this is the trap Vlad walked into. Because after the dramatic campaign of 1462, after the scorched earth, after the night attack,
after the forest of the impaled, after he forced the greatest military machine of the age to hesitate. After all that, he needed allies. And allies, unlike enemies, remember cruelty. This brings us to the philosophical fulcrum of his story. How much cruelty can a ruler wield before the world decides he should not exist? This question is not medieval. It is eternal. Allies turned. Friends found excuses. Hungary saw him not as an asset, but as a liability. And the web that had held him in place unraveled. His imprisonment under Matthias Corvinus is one of the clearest examples of political convenience dressed as moral judgment. The same king who praised Vlad's anti-Ottoman zeal suddenly condemned him when it suited diplomatic needs. The same Christian leader who had celebrated Vlad's scorched earth tactics quietly filed false letters claiming Vlad had betrayed the Christian cause. Reality did not matter. Utility did. That is the cold geometry of power. Allies do not abandon you when you commit atrocities. They abandon you when your atrocities cease to be useful. Now step back and look at the narrative arc from a distance. This is the story of a man who tried to carve order out of chaos with weapons that ultimately destroyed him. A prince who learned fear as a child, wielded fear as a ruler, and died because fear has no loyalty. The world turns. The grave swallows. The story recedes. But now something astonishing happens. The philosophical shift that reshapes history. A dead prince becomes raw material. Not for historians. Not for
political theorists. For storytellers. Centuries pass. Europe industrializes. Old fears shift into new shapes. Anxiety about death, sexuality, disease, the uncertain border between life and afterlife. And into this cultural landscape walks Bram Stoker. Not a historian, not a folklorist, a novelist. Stoker finds the name Dracula in an obscure book filled with details about Transylvania. He reads of a prince who fought the Turks. He notices that the word Dracula is associated with dragons and devils. And in that moment, a tiny moment, a trivial moment, something irreversible happens. A historical figure becomes a vessel. Stoker did not try to recreate Vlad. He didn't even understand Vlad. He simply took the name, a name dense with centuries of local meaning, and used it like a candle in a Gothic room, casting new shadows on old walls. The connection between Vlad and the vampire is accidental but not meaningless, because myth does not need truth. Myth needs resonance. Vlad's life, filled with blood, war, betrayal, imprisonment, murder, fear, carried all the emotional energy a novelist could ever want. All Stoker did was pour that energy into a supernatural mold. And now we arrive at the philosophical core of the legend. The world remembers Vlad not because of what he did, but because his story was useful. People do not preserve history. People preserve meaning. The vampire survives because he embodies timeless fears. Fear of predation, fear of decay, fear of power without conscience, fear of death without rest. The man Vlad survives only in archives. The monster Dracula survives in imagination. Which one is more powerful? Which one is more real? If you measure reality by historical fact, Vlad wins. If you measure reality by cultural impact, Dracula wins. This duality, man and myth, creates a philosophical mirror. One shows what humans do. The other shows what humans fear. And over time, the fears proved stronger. But the final twist is the one people rarely talk about. Vlad the human teaches us more about ourselves than Dracula the vampire ever could. Because supernatural monsters are easy to hate, human cruelty is harder to confront. Myth distracts us from uncomfortable truths. History forces us to confront them. And now, as the narrative edges closer to its transformation, from prince to legend, from man to myth, you can see why this story endures. It's not about blood. It's not about immortality. It's not about vampires at all. It's about how we choose our monsters. It's about how we humanize or dehumanize the past. It's about the stories we create to explain the parts of humanity we don't want to see directly. We fear the vampire because he drinks blood. We fear the historical Vlad because he shows us what humans are capable of. The myth lets us sleep. The history wakes us. And somewhere in that tension, between sleep and wakefulness, between imagination and reality, the legend
continues to evolve.
It is one thing for a legend to be born from fact. It is another thing entirely for a legend to eclipse fact so completely that the world forgets the difference. This is where the transformation begins. Not in 15th century Wallachia, not in the court of Vlad's enemies, not in the woodcut pamphlets printed to smear him, but in the quiet mind of a novelist, centuries later, staring at a page in a library with no idea what he's about to unleash. Before Stoker, the world remembered Vlad only in fragments. Romanian villagers remembered him as a stern, iron-willed defender. Hungarian nobles remembered him as a dangerous, unpredictable ally. German merchants remembered him as a tyrant who taxed and punished cruelly. Ottoman chroniclers remembered him as a stubborn enemy who preferred death to submission. Memory, then, was divided, political, regional, fractured. What Stoker did, unintentionally, was fuse all these conflicting memories into a single archetype, distilling centuries of fear, folklore, and half-recalled history into one universal figure. But before we examine how fiction consumed fact, we need to understand the intellectual soil that allowed the transformation to take root. Because fiction does not rise from a vacuum, it rises from a need. And in the late 19th century, the English-speaking world had needs it could not consciously articulate, fears shifting beneath the surface of Victorian society. Let me show you. Victorian England was anxious about death, anxious about sexuality, anxious about the foreign, the exotic, the unknown, anxious about diseases that passed invisibly from one person to another, anxious about the collapse of old moral systems, anxious about the rise of science that explained too much and too little at the same time. What is a vampire, if not the perfect embodiment of all these fears? A stranger from another land, seductive, dangerous, unbound by morality, invading the home, corrupting the innocent, defying death, defying God, feeding on the lifeblood of a decaying society. Stoker did not invent these anxieties. He simply gave them a face, a name, a lineage. Dracula. The name carried the taste of history, sharp, foreign, ancient. It suggested darkness, dread, nobility, violence. It evoked the dragon, the devil, the warrior prince who stood on the frontier between worlds. Once printed, the name became inseparable from the myth it carried. But pause for a moment and consider how strange this is. Most historical figures fade. Kings vanish into textbooks. Warriors dissolve into dust. The past dissolves the way mountains dissolve, slowly, silently. Yet Vlad did not vanish. He mutated. The question is, why him? Why not another cruel ruler? Why not another medieval tyrant? Why not another prince with a violent legacy? Because Vlad's story has a shape that lends itself to transformation. Trauma in childhood, betrayal by loved ones, hostagehood in a foreign empire, return from exile, brutal methods of rule, conflicts with a mighty empire, multiple rises and falls, a violent death, a missing grave, a name associated with dragons and devils. It feels like myth. Even without vampires, it would feel like myth. People subconsciously gravitate toward narratives with mythic structure. The fallen prince, the avenger, the tyrant, the doomed warrior, the betrayed hero, the man feared by all sides, the ruler whose death solves nothing, the story that refuses to close. Add to that the fact that his final resting place is uncertain, no identifiable skull, no confirmed bones, and you have the perfect vessel for a supernatural afterlife. History leaves gaps, folklore fills them. Darkness loves cracks, and where history cracked, legends seep through like mist. But let's follow the transformation slowly, step by step, because rushing through this would miss the philosophical weight of what happened. Imagine a bridge, one end rooted in documented reality, the other end fading into imagination. Vlad stands firmly at the historical end. But the bridge is long, and as you walk along it, the details become softer, more symbolic. The political cruelty becomes moral cruelty. The moral cruelty becomes supernatural malice. The supernatural malice becomes immortality. The immortality becomes archetype. The archetype becomes legend. The legend becomes inevitable. The world needed a face for its fears. Vlad's name was available. A novelist picked it up, and the transformation began. Stoker did not research Wallachian archives. He did not interview Romanian historians. He did not study Ottoman chronicles. He simply borrowed the name because it sounded right. This is how myth often works, not through accuracy, but through resonance. What resonated was the idea of Vlad, not the documents, not the geopolitical context, not his real motivations, not his wars or reforms, but the shadow, the atmosphere, the silhouette, a distant foreign prince who ruled with eerie brutality, whose life was marked by blood, war, and betrayal, whose home was surrounded by mountains and forests, older than empires, whose reputation survived him like a stain on the land. Stoker built his Count Dracula on that silhouette. The vampire was not the man was not the vampire, but the silhouette was both. And so, slowly, fiction began infiltrating memory. At first, small things. Travel writers in the early 20th century mentioned Vlad in the same breath as vampires. Tourist brochures linked Bran Castle to the fictional Count, despite weak historical ties. Students confused the man with the myth. Teachers simplified the complexity, not from malice, but convenience. Then films amplified the fusion. Nosferatu turned the vampire into a stark symbol of plague and predation. Bela Lugosi transformed the Count into a seductive aristocrat. Christopher Lee reinterpreted him as a tragic predator. Later films added love, desire, and eternal longing to the figure. Each version layered new meaning onto the name. Dracula the vampire evolved. Dracula the man decayed. Over time, the myth became the more powerful memory. People forgot the historical prince, but remembered the fictional Count. The vampire became true, and the man became a footnote. But here is the philosophical paradox. Fiction preserved Vlad more effectively than history ever could. If Stoker had never used his name, Vlad would remain in the margins of Eastern European history. Known by scholars, argued about in academic circles, occasionally mentioned by Romanian nationalists, largely ignored by the rest of the world. Instead, he became immortal. Not personally, not intentionally, not accurately, but immortal nonetheless. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, myth is a better preservative than fact. History preserves documentation. Myth preserves emotion. History records what happened. Myth records what we fear, desire, admire, reject. History explains. Myth resonates. And resonance endures. So now we arrive at the threshold between memory and meaning. There are two Draculas in the world. One is Vlad, the human prince, the product of trauma and geopolitics, a ruler shaped by violence and necessity, a man whose brutality was extreme but not supernatural. The other is Count Dracula, the vampire, a supernatural being born not from Wallachian soil but from Victorian dread, a creature forged by fiction rather than blood. But there is also a third Dracula, the one we rarely talk about, the Dracula that exists in our minds, the one shaped by our personal fears, our cultural needs, our fascination with darkness. This inner Dracula changes from person to person. For some, he is a monster, an embodiment of cruelty. For others, he is tragedy, a man broken into myth. For others still, he is allure, power unbound by morality. For some, a metaphor for exploitation or predation. For some, a symbol of immortal resistance. For others, a cautionary tale about power without checks. This inner Dracula reveals more about us than about Vlad, because the stories we cling to say something about the fractures inside us. Why do we keep reviving this character? Why do we return to vampires again and again? Why does this one figure continue to rise from the literary grave? Perhaps because he represents the part of humanity that refuses to die, the part that fears death, loves power, craves immortality, resists vulnerability. Vlad the Prince wanted control because he lived in a world where losing control meant death. Dracula the vampire wants control because he fears eternity alone. And we, the audience, return to these stories because we fear ourselves. This is why the legend endures. It satisfies a human need to turn overwhelming historical truths into symbols we can process, symbols that feel safer, even when they are frightening. The vampire drains blood, the prince drained hope. But the story drains neither. It feeds us. It feeds our imagination. It feeds our fascination with darkness. It feeds our desire to understand cruelty without confronting the cruelty within. Now the final layer of the transition reveals itself. The story of Dracula is not about a monster. It is about how we create monsters. We take historical figures and transform them to fit moral narratives. We take trauma and turn it into folklore. We take political cruelty and turn it into supernatural evil. We take human complexity and flatten it into archetype. This transformation is not accidental. It is useful. It gives us a way to distance ourselves from brutal realities by placing them in the realm of fantasy. It allows us to condemn evil without examining the systems that produce it. It allows us to fear death without contemplating its reality. It allows us to imagine immortality without facing the psychological cost of endless life. It allows us to see cruelty as alien, something inhuman, rather than acknowledging that humans create cruelty in systems, in governments, in wars, in prisons, in policies. Dracula the vampire is a mask we place over the face of history so that we do not have to confront the face beneath the mask. But if you lift that mask gently, you see something more haunting than fangs. You see a man, not a monster. A man shaped by war, fear, betrayal, trauma, desperation, and power. A man whose life is not a cautionary tale about supernatural darkness, but about the human capacity to normalize cruelty when the world demands it. A man who could have been different if the world around him had been different. This is where the story bends toward its end. An ending not of fear, but of understanding. It is easy to say that Vlad Dracula became a monster. It is harder to admit that the monster we remember is one we invented. Because the truth is that the world did not simply inherit Dracula, it curated him. With every generation, people added something: a fear, a desire, a cultural tension, a symbolic meaning, a layer of shadow on top of shadow. The man disappeared beneath the weight of those layers, and what survived was not the prince, not the politician, not even the tyrant, but the metaphor. Myth lets us compress reality until it feels manageable. And the more overwhelming the reality, the more potent the myth becomes. But now let's move beyond the transformation itself and explore something even deeper. Why does the myth refuse to die? Why does Dracula remain immortal, not as a character, but as an idea? To answer that, we must consider something uncomfortable. Dracula has survived because he adapts to whatever the world fears most. Every era reshapes him. Every culture projects itself onto him. Every generation reinvents him to reflect its own anxieties. And if we map these reinventions, we see something remarkable. Dracula is less a character and more a psychological mirror. Not a window into Vlad's mind, a window into ours. Let me show you how this works. 1. The medieval fear, moral chaos. In the 15th century, the world feared instability. Battles were constant, borders shifted, empires swallowed kingdoms, princes betrayed fathers, religion divided continents. People feared cruelty not because it was foreign, but because it was familiar. Vlad became a symbol in that era, not of supernatural evil, but of human extremity. He was a warning. This is what happens when the world breaks. That first version of Dracula was political, not mystical. 2. The Victorian fear, the foreign invader. By the late 19th century, Europe's fears had changed. Industrialization had transformed society. Cities grew crowded, diseases spread quickly. Immorality seemed to lurk in the shadows of the modern age. Victorian England feared foreign influence, sexual transgression, the collapse of religious certainty, scientific discoveries that disrupted old beliefs. Stoker's Dracula became the perfect vessel for these anxieties. A foreign aristocrat arriving in London, invading the domestic sphere, seducing women, ignoring moral laws, desecrating Christian sacredness, surviving death. He reflected the Victorian fear that civilization was a thin shell over something ancient and predatory. The vampire emerged because society needed a symbol for its shadow. 3. The 20th century fear, the unstoppable predator. The early 1900s saw world wars, pandemics, economic collapse. People feared forces they could not control: industrial slaughter, viral disease, ideological extremism. Cinema turned Dracula into a figure of pure predation. Nosferatu, 1922, made him a ghoul, a plague in human form.
Lugosi, 1931, made him a hypnotic aristocratic menace, charming but lethal. Lee, 1958 to 1970s, made him violent, powerful, unstoppable. This was an age obsessed with external threats: invaders, dictators, viruses, bombs. Dracula adapted to that fear. He became the predator who cannot die, the threat that cannot be reasoned with, the monster who comes back again and again. 4. The late 20th century fear, ourselves. Then something interesting happened. Audiences stopped fearing external predators. They began fearing themselves, their desires, their shadows, their moral contradictions. The vampire changed again. Dracula became tragic, lonely, conflicted, seductive. Coppola's 1992 film gave him emotional depth. Anne Rice's books made vampires self-reflective, even soulful. Dracula evolved into something unthinkable to medieval Europe, a creature worthy of empathy. This version reflects our fear not of death, but of lovelessness, rootlessness, identity without humanity. We stopped fearing monsters. We feared becoming them. 5. The modern fear, immortality without purpose. Today, the world fears emptiness more than darkness. We fear a life without meaning, a world that changes too fast, an identity that dissolves into digital noise. Modern vampires, including Dracula, are often portrayed as ancient.
Beings who have lived so long they have forgotten why. They are lonely, they are tired, they are desperate for connection that does not exist. This is not a supernatural fear, it is existential. Dracula now mirrors our dread of endless time with nothing to anchor us. He reflects our fear of surviving ourselves. But now let's step out of cinema and literature and return to the land that birthed the name, Romania. A country that has had to carry the strange burden of being associated internationally, not with its poets, not with its thinkers, not with its saints or scientists, but with a vampire. Imagine that burden. Imagine being asked about blood-drinking legends when you are a scholar studying Byzantine history. Imagine your ancient fortresses being misunderstood as supernatural lairs rather than military outposts. Imagine tourists arriving looking for Gothic tropes rather than the real complexities of your past. Dracula brings money to Romania, yes, but he also brings misunderstanding. Romania has had to negotiate this strange inheritance, to decide whether to resist the legend or embrace it. The result is a careful balancing act. Celebrate the tourism, acknowledge the myth, respect the history, protect the truth, correct the misconceptions, but do not destroy the fascination. This is not hypocrisy, it is survival. Just as Vlad governed through contradiction, Romania today manages a contradiction. Dracula is both a distortion and a resource. Ask Romanian historians whether Vlad was a hero or a monster, and you get nuanced answers. Ask Romanian citizens, and you get a spectrum. Defender, tyrant, necessary evil, patriotic symbol, war criminal, misunderstood, victim of propaganda, local legend, tourist trap, complicated. Complicated, yes. History is almost always complicated. Myth is almost always simple. And this brings us to the deepest point of the entire story. Dracula survived because myth is stronger than truth. But Vlad matters because truth is stronger than myth. Let that settle for a moment. Myth endures because it resonates emotionally. Truth endures because it explains reality. Neither replaces the other. Both are necessary. Vlad's truth tells us how cruelty evolves within systems. Dracula's myth tells us how fear evolves within cultures. One teaches us history, the other teaches us psychology. Together, they form a map of how societies survive, how stories transform, how power shapes memory, how memory shapes identity, how identity shapes mythology. But the story is still not finished, because we have not answered the final, most important question. What does the legend of Dracula reveal about us, the ones who keep telling it? The answer lies in the next step of the journey, what it means that we prefer the monster to the man, and why the man's real story, raw, political, human, is more haunting than any. Vampire tale. There is a reason humanity prefers the monster to the man. The monster is easier.
A monster is simple, predictable, self-contained. A creature made entirely of darkness with no ambiguity, no contradiction, no inconvenient humanity. A monster can be destroyed, feared, avoided, or admired from a safe distance. A man cannot. A man forces us to confront the conditions that shape him. A man forces us to consider how we might behave under similar pressures. A man forces us to acknowledge that cruelty does not appear out of nowhere. It is cultivated by trauma, war, politics, and necessity. And that is precisely what makes Vlad more disturbing than Dracula. Because Dracula is supernatural. Vlad is human. Dracula is horror fiction. Vlad is historical reality. Dracula kills because he is cursed. Vlad killed because he made choices. Choices within a system that rewarded brutality. Dracula symbolizes evil. Vlad forces us to question what we call evil and why it emerges. We fear Dracula as a predator. We fear Vlad because he shows us predation within ourselves. And this is the philosophical heart of the story. We created the supernatural monster to avoid facing the human one. Because if we truly looked at Vlad, not as a caricature, not through propaganda, not through Hollywood, we would have to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. What would you have done in a land where betrayal was routine? Where nobles murdered your father? Where your brother sided with your enemy? Where empires demanded tribute under threat of annihilation? Where weakness invited invasion? Where mercy collapsed thrones? We don't like these questions. They suggest that morality is not fixed but situational, that goodness is fragile under pressure, that humans are capable of shaping their ethics to match the demands of survival. These truths are harder to look at than a vampire's fangs. And so, instinctively, we reach for myth. We transform complexity into simplicity. We flatten the man into a monster. But the legend of Dracula also reveals something else, something even more startling. We are far more comfortable with eternal evil than with contextual evil. Eternal evil is clean. It is a character type, a literary device, a form of entertainment. Contextual evil is untidy. It implicates society. It exposes systems. It forces accountability. Consider the historical landscape Vlad inhabited. Corruption was routine. Violence was normal. Loyalty was transactional. War was constant. Diplomacy was fragile. Religion was weaponized. Power was survival. In such a landscape, we find the conditions where atrocities are not aberrations. They are strategies. Not anomalies, but norms. Remove the supernatural gloss, and the true horror emerges. Cruelty thrives not because of monsters, but because of systems that reward it. That is the truth fiction tries to hide. Because once you accept that cruelty is systemic, once you accept that humans can become
instruments of terror under pressure, you have to confront the uncomfortable possibility. Monsters are not born, they are made. And if they can be made, then we, society, culture, politics, history, are part of the machinery that makes them. This realization changes everything. It shifts the Dracula legend from folklore to philosophy. Because what makes Vlad's story enduring is not the gore. It's not the impalements. It's not the wars or betrayals. It's not the forests of the dead. It's the existential truth his life forces us to face. Evil is not supernatural. It is human, adaptive, rational, and often rewarded. This is why so many cultures chose to escape into myth. It is safer to imagine a vampire than to confront the political brutality that shaped Europe. Safer to blame darkness on a supernatural predator than on fellow human beings building systems of violence. Safer to believe that evil has fangs and sleeps in a coffin than to admit it wears crowns and sits on thrones. Safer to fear the undead than to fear the living. Vampires cannot be reasoned with. Humans can, and that makes them more dangerous. But there is another reason the myth overtook the man. Vampires offer catharsis. History rarely does. A vampire can be hunted. A vampire can be killed. A vampire can be contained by rules, sunlight, garlic, stakes, holy water. History does not offer such clean solutions. You cannot stab a political system. You cannot burn a trauma. You cannot pray away corruption. You cannot expose cruelty to sunlight and hope it dissolves. History confronts us with problems that cannot be defeated, only understood. And we prefer stories where understanding isn't necessary. This is why the legend of Dracula persists. Not as a distortion, but as a coping mechanism. As long as we believe evil is supernatural, we can pretend it is rare. As long as we believe cruelty belongs to monsters, we can pretend it does not live within us. As long as we believe terror is the mark of the undead, we can avoid acknowledging the cruelty embedded in our own societies. Dracula offers escape. Vlad offers confrontation. Dracula reassures. Vlad challenges. Dracula frightens us in comfortable ways. Vlad frightens us in truthful ways. But now, having explored psychology, memory, and myth, we move into the most haunting question of all, the one that gives the story its true philosophical weight. Why do we keep resurrecting Dracula? Why does this archetype refuse to die? The answer lies not in Vlad, not in Stoker, not in Hollywood, but in us. Because Dracula represents something timeless and universal: the fear of death, the desire for control, the hunger for immortality, the seduction of power, the cost of trauma, the shadow of violence, the complexity of identity, the thin line between protector and tyrant, the paradox of human cruelty, the human fascination with darkness. Dracula survives because we keep feeding him. Not with blood, that's fiction. We feed him with relevance, with new fears, new anxieties, new cultural crises, new systems of power that mirror old ones. Every age sees itself in the vampire. Victorian England saw sexual repression and foreign invasion. The 20th century saw war, plague, totalitarianism. The late 20th century saw identity crisis and loneliness. The 21st century sees digital immortality, moral ambiguity, and existential dread. In each version, Dracula shifts shape. And yet, something of Vlad remains. Not the cruelty, not the tactics, not the impalements or battles or betrayals, but the underlying truth. Power wounds, trauma shapes, fear governs, systems break, humans adapt, legends survive. This is the final convergence of man and myth. Vlad was not undead, but his story refuses to die. Dracula was not human, but he reflects human fears perfectly. And now we stand in the most important place of all, the threshold between myth and meaning, the place where this story becomes more than history, more than folklore, more than entertainment. It becomes a meditation on us. Because the Dracula legend endures not because of Vlad and not because of Stoker, but because it expresses something about the human experience that is older than both. Our relationship with darkness, our desire to understand it, our fear of being consumed by it, and our fascination with how close it lives to the surface. Now the story turns toward its philosophical conclusion, the quiet reflection that ties centuries together and shows why the legend still matters in a world nothing like Vlad's. There is a moment when a story becomes fully aware of itself, that it stops being about the person it describes and starts being about the people who keep retelling it. We have reached that moment, because now we must examine not Vlad the man, not Dracula the myth, but the gap between the two, the shadow region where humanity projects what it fears, what it desires, what it refuses to acknowledge in itself. This gap is not accidental. It is architecture. It exists because we built it. Every generation added bricks. A rumor here, a pamphlet there, a stage production, a novel, a film, a symbol, a misunderstanding, a fantasy. And now the gap is so wide, so deep, so thick with imagination that stepping across it feels like crossing a border between worlds. The world of the dead and the world of the undead. But the truth is quieter. This is not a supernatural boundary. It is a psychological one. We created it because it protects us. Protects us from what? From the uncomfortable fact that a human, not a demon, not a creature of darkness, committed acts so extreme they felt inhuman. Rather than face this truth, we invented the vampire. It is easier to say a monster did it, cleaner, safer, emotionally efficient. Because if Vlad remains human, then humanity must take responsibility for what humans can do. And that is far scarier than any vampire. So,
We must now ask the most difficult question of all. What does our enduring obsession with Dracula reveal about us as a species? It reveals that we fear our own potential for cruelty more than any supernatural threat. It reveals that we prefer symbolic evil to systemic evil. It reveals that we would rather personify darkness than analyze it. It reveals that we turn human tragedy into myth when reality is too complex to bear.
This is the true philosophical weight of the Dracula legend. But let's go deeper. A truth we avoid. Power is seductive even when it terrifies us. One reason Dracula persists is because he is both repellent and magnetic. This tension, disgust and desire, reflects something uncomfortable about human nature. People are drawn to power even when that power is dangerous. Territory, dominance, freedom from mortality, freedom from moral accountability, freedom from the constraints of ordinary life. Vlad, as a ruler, wielded terrifying power, the power to instill fear, to enforce order, to shape society through punishment. Dracula, as a myth, wields a different kind of power, the power to seduce, to transgress, to transcend death. Both forms of power fascinate us, because humans do not simply fear the dark. We are attracted to it, not to cruelty itself, but to what cruelty represents, the absence of limits. Vlad crossed limits ruthlessly. Dracula crosses them effortlessly. This makes the myth intoxicating. It lets us explore forbidden edges of the psyche from the safety of fiction. A truth we fear. Immortality is a curse, not a gift. Modern portrayals often paint Dracula as weary, lonely, timeless. This reflects a modern fear, the fear of endless existence without meaning. In an age where technology races ahead, where memories are stored in clouds, where digital footprints last forever, where artificial intelligence threatens to outlive its creators, Dracula becomes a metaphor for the most modern anxiety of all. Eternity without purpose. Time that stretches too far. Life that refuses to conclude. Consciousness trapped in endless repetition. Identity eroded by centuries. Humanity lost in the slow, cold drift of immortality. This is not superstition. It is existential dread, and Dracula carries it perfectly. A truth we resist. History is harder to accept than myth. When you strip away fantasy, you find a Vlad who fought invading empires, faced impossible choices, lived inside trauma, ruled a land on the brink, used terror as policy, died betrayed by his own allies. This is not a comfortable narrative. A vampire is easier to explain. He killed because he was cursed. A prince is harder. He killed because humans sometimes choose cruelty. Myth simplifies. History complicates. Myth anesthetizes. History confronts. Myth absolves. History exposes. This is why the world embraced Dracula the vampire longer and more passionately than Vlad the ruler. We prefer a clean monster to a complicated man, a truth we ignore. Monsters reflect the era that invents them. Dracula has never been fixed. He evolves with us. In the 1400s, Vlad symbolized tyranny and disorder. In the 1800s, Dracula symbolized foreign corruption and forbidden desire. In the 1900s, he symbolized predation, disease, war, and totalitarian fear. In the late 1900s, he symbolized loneliness, isolation, and tragic immortality. In the 2000s, he symbolizes identity crisis, moral ambiguity, and existential dread. Each transformation reveals the fears of the time. He is not immortal because he drinks blood. He is immortal because fear is immortal, and fear wears whatever mask the age requires. A truth we forget. The real Vlad teaches us more than fiction ever will. Vlad's real story, as brutal as it is, offers lessons fiction cannot. How fragile political systems create brutal leaders. How trauma shapes governance. How power incentivizes cruelty. How fear can stabilize or destroy societies. How heroic defense and monstrous violence can coexist in one person. How propaganda shapes legacy. How myth can overwrite history. These lessons are uncomfortable, but they are essential. Dracula the vampire teaches us to fear the night. Vlad the human teaches us to question the world. One is entertainment, one is enlightenment. We need both, but only one can protect us from repeating history. And now, the final turn. The two Draculas converge again. After centuries of separation, myth drifting in one direction, history in another, modern storytelling has begun weaving them back together. Look at recent adaptations. The vampire is now portrayed with elements of the historical Vlad, warrior past, trauma, betrayal, rage, loneliness, the burden of leadership, flashes of humanity beneath monstrosity. Why? Because audiences today crave complexity. We want monsters with depth. We want villains with motivations. We want supernatural beings with human pain. In a strange way, the world is finally ready to hear the true story, not as history, not as folklore, but as a fusion of both. A man who ruled through fear, a myth that ruled through seduction, a legacy that spans continents and centuries, a shadow that reflects every generation that retells it. This is why the legend never dies. Because every time Dracula rises from his coffin, it is not Vlad rising. It is us. Our fears, our shadows, our contradictions, our hunger for meaning, our discomfort with our own history, our attempts to understand darkness without being consumed by it. And so the final truth emerges. We resurrect Dracula not because he is immortal, but because we are haunted by questions we have never answered. What is evil? What shapes a human life? What does power do to a person? What are we capable of? What do we fear in ourselves? What do we deny about our nature? Why does darkness fascinate us? And why, after so many centuries, do we still tell this story? These questions do not belong to Vlad. They belong to humanity. Dracula simply gives them a face. There is a point in every old story where the narrative stops moving forward and begins folding inward. A moment when the tale stops describing events and starts revealing truths. We are standing precisely at that moment now. We have walked beside Vlad through blood and betrayal. We have seen how myth dissolved his humanity. We have watched his name drift into fiction. We have traced how the world reshaped him to suit its fears. But now the legend shifts again, and the final meaning begins to emerge. Not from the historical Vlad, not from the supernatural Dracula, but from the electric tension between them. Because the real center of this story is not the man, not the vampire, but the shadow that connects them. A shadow that stretches across 5 centuries of human imagination. A shadow that teaches us the most uncomfortable truth of all. We use monsters to hide from mirrors. Standing here at the threshold of conclusion, I want you to imagine 2 figures standing side by side in a darkened corridor of time. On the left, Vlad, armored, scarred, mortal, born into war, shaped by trauma, hardened by politics. On the right, Dracula, pale, elegant, immortal, an invention of literature, shaped by collective fear, sustained by imagination. At first, they look nothing alike. A prince and a phantom, a ruler and a revenant, a historical figure and a mythic archetype. But stare long enough and something subtle shifts. Their silhouettes begin to echo one another. The line between them blurs. The gap begins to close. Why? Because neither figure is complete on his own. Vlad without Dracula is brutal history without meaning. Dracula without Vlad is fantasy without gravity. Together they form a single, haunting truth. Human darkness and mythic darkness are reflections of one another. One explains the world as it was. The other explains the world as we fear it could be. One is political. The other is psychological. Both tell us something essential about ourselves. This is why the story endures. This is why the world refuses to let Dracula die. But now, in the final stretch of this journey, another realization rises quietly. We never truly feared Dracula. We feared what Dracula symbolized. Dracula is not really about blood, or bats, or coffins, or immortality. Dracula is about transgression. He crosses lines we secretly wonder about. He breaks rules we quietly fear. He embodies desires we pretend not to have. He symbolizes the part of the human psyche that whispers instead of shouts. If the historical prince teaches us that violence is a tool of survival, the vampire teaches us that identity is a fragile, shifting thing. Vlad is a study in how circumstance shapes morality. Dracula is a study in how fantasy shapes fear. Put them together and they reveal something about humanity we rarely admit. We are creatures torn between instinct and imagination, between what we are and what we fear we might become. This is the philosophical core of the Dracula myth. And yet, there is something even deeper beneath the surface. Something the world rarely recognizes because it sits too quietly behind the noise of folklore. It is this. Dracula survived because the world needed a story about a man who could not die, in an age terrified by how quickly everything else does. Look at the centuries that followed Vlad's death. Empires rose and fell, languages shifted, borders changed, wars broke continents, science transformed reality, cities emerged and collapsed, nations appeared and disappeared, beliefs died and were reborn. Amid all that chaos, Dracula did not change. He adapted, yes, but he never disappeared. He became the anchor in a world without anchors, a constant, a landmark, a figure that outlived the culture studying him. In that sense, Dracula's immortality is symbolic, not supernatural. He is immortal because he fills a role that societies keep needing, the figure that holds our fears for us so we don't have to hold them alone. And this brings us to the most haunting realization of all. Monsters survive because they carry the burdens we cannot. Dracula carries the fear of death. Vlad carries the fear of cruelty. The legend carries the fear of ourselves. You may not encounter a vampire in your lifetime, but you will encounter power used carelessly, fear used politically, trauma turned into aggression, systems that reward cruelty, people shaped by circumstances beyond their control, societies that create the very monsters they later condemn. That is the true darkness. It lives not in castles or crypts, but in the decisions human beings make when their world gives them impossible choices. This is why the legend matters, not because it frightens us, but because it reveals us. And now, as we near the end of this long, meditative journey, we can finally see what Vlad's story and Dracula's story has been trying to teach all along. It is not about blood. It is not about immortality. It is not about evil. It is not about fangs, coffins, capes, or castles. It is about the fragility of morality and how quickly it can crumble under pressure. It is about the weight of trauma and how it distorts the shape of a life. It is about the power of memory and how it can preserve or distort truth. It is about the hunger for myth and how we use it to shield ourselves from reality. It is about the human fear of endings and the seductive fantasy of never having to face one. Vlad's story ends in violence. Dracula's story refuses to end at all. And we stand between the two, trying to understand which version teaches us more. The answer is both, but for different reasons. Vlad teaches us about the world. Dracula teaches us about ourselves. One is a lesson in history. The other is a lesson in humanity. And together, they create a final truth. We are haunted, not by monsters, but by our need to invent them. We fear not the undead, but the parts of ourselves we bury. We seek immortality not in blood, but in stories. And the stories we keep alive are the ones that speak to our deepest fears. This is the immortal legacy of Dracula, not as a vampire, not as a prince, but as a mirror. And now, one last step remains. One final reflection to close the circle and place the legend back into your hands with clarity, quiet, and meaning. There is a quiet that comes at the end of a long story. Not silence, not relief, something gentler, a settling. It feels like dust floating in a beam of light, like standing in an empty hall where echoes finally stop repeating, like reaching the end of a forest trail and realizing you've been walking in circles, but the path still taught you something. We have walked with Vlad. We have walked with Dracula. We have walked with myth, memory, trauma, narrative, power, fear, desire, and the strange human habit of turning people into symbols. Now all that remains is the stillness after understanding. Not answers, understanding. Because stories like this do not end with certainty, they end with clarity. And here is the clarity. Dracula is not about a man. Dracula is not about a monster. Dracula is about the human fascination with darkness. We are drawn to the places where logic dissolves, where morality bends, where identity blurs, where history meets imagination, where fear meets desire, where humanity meets myth. Dracula sits at that intersection like an ancient sentinel, a reminder that we understand ourselves best in the shadows, not in the light. But to close this story properly, we must return to the man one last time. Imagine him, not the vampire, the man, standing on the walls of Targovishta, facing down an empire larger than anything he could ever hope to defeat. The night cold, the sky dark, the torches flickering in the wind, the forest of impaled prisoners rising in silence behind him. He is not supernatural. He is not immortal. He is not a creature of the night. He is a human, tired, angry, traumatized, brilliant, ruthless, shaped by forces beyond his control. He is fighting a war he cannot win. He is ruling a land that will betray him. He is trying to hold a world together by force. He is not thinking about vampires. He is not thinking about novels. He is not thinking about immortality. He is thinking about survival, about legacy, about revenge, about the fear that shaped him, about the power he seized because he believed it was the only way to control that fear. When he dies, violently, abruptly, he does not know what his name will become. He does not know he will be turned into a myth. He does not know his identity will be rewritten so thoroughly that the world will forget the real man. He does not know that centuries later, people will walk through theme parks and film sets, believing they understand the story because they know the myth. He does not know that. A novelist, in a distant country, will find his name in a travel book and reshape history. He dies thinking his story is finished, but the strange thing is, it never finished. It changed form. History buried the man. Fiction resurrected the shadow. This is the paradox at the heart of Dracula. Vlad the man died. Dracula the symbol never will. Why? Because the symbol no longer belongs to Vlad. It belongs to us. We use Dracula to understand fear. We use him to explore mortality. We use him to question identity. We use him to wrestle with power. We use him to externalize guilt. We use him to satisfy curiosity about the forbidden. We use him to navigate the hidden corners of the psyche. We use him to hold the things we cannot look at directly. The vampire is not frightening because he drinks blood. He is frightening because he takes something we cannot live without. The certainty that good and evil are simple. Dracula erases that certainty. He blurs lines. He blends familiarity with nightmare. He fuses humanity with monstrosity. He forces us to ask whether darkness is something outside us, or something inside us that we prefer not to see. But now, here is the final truth. The truth the story circles toward. The truth that sits quietly under every retelling. We do not resurrect Dracula because we fear him. We resurrect him because we recognize him. Not the violence, not the cruelty, not the predation, but the contradictions, the longing, the loneliness, the hunger for meaning, the fear of death, the search for power, the desire to escape human limits, the consequences of trauma, the temptation to cross boundaries, the weight of identity, the need to be remembered. These are not supernatural questions. They are human ones. And that is why the Dracula legend refuses to die. Because it is not a legend about monsters. It is a legend about being human. Vlad's brutality shows us the human capacity for harm. His trauma shows us how pain shapes identity. His politics show us how fear builds systems. His downfall shows us the fragility of power. His myth shows us the evolution of cultural memory. Dracula the vampire shows us the symbolic form of these truths. The enduring fear of the unknown, the desire to transcend mortality, the seduction of power, the danger of desire, the blurring of moral boundaries, the timelessness of darkness. Together, they show us what it means to be human in a world where fear and myth shape our lives. And now, the story rests. The man has returned to history. The myth has returned to imagination. The shadow has returned to silence. You, listening quietly in the dim of your room, now carry both legacies, the truth of Vlad and the meaning of Dracula. The next time you see the vampire in a film, the next time you hear his name in a story, the next time you watch him rise from a coffin or cast no reflection, you will know that beneath every fictional shadow stands a real human being. Flawed, complex, brutal, brilliant, broken, just like the rest of us. And the next time you read history, the next time you hear tales of cruelty or power, you will remember that myth is rarely born from nothing. It is born from the echoes of real lives lived under impossible weight. The story of Dracula is finished for tonight, but the legend, the fascination, the questions, the darkness and the meaning will stay with you long after the lights fade. Sleep now, knowing that the monsters you fear are older than fiction, and simpler than blood, and closer than you think. Sleep knowing that history and imagination are not opposites, they are partners in the stories we tell. Sleep knowing that the line between man and myth is thin, fragile, and endlessly fascinating. Sleep knowing that darkness is not something to fear, but something to understand. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle, your thoughts be deep, and your rest be free of both princes and vampires.